Some doors don't keep danger out, they keep the truth from escaping. Claire Dawson had never imagined that a forgotten audit file would become the reason her life divided itself into a before and an after. The logistics company's downtown Chicago headquarters had been nearly empty by the time she returned just after 9:30 p.m., the polished lobby glowing beneath soft recessed lights, while rain tapped steadily against the glass walls overlooking the street. She hated coming back after hours, but the missing binder contained invoices scheduled for a federal review the following morning, and her reputation had been built on one simple rule: never leave loose ends behind. The security guard barely looked up from his football game as she flashed her employee badge and stepped into the elevator, expecting a quiet 15 minutes before driving home. Unfortunately for her, someone had disabled the elevator's automatic floor restrictions less than 20 minutes earlier. Claire pressed the button for the archive level without noticing the panel briefly flicker before continuing downward past the basement she knew existed. The gentle hum changed. The elevator descended farther than it ever should have. She frowned, glancing at the display as unfamiliar numbers appeared one after another before the doors finally slid open with a soft mechanical sigh. The hallway beyond wasn't part of the building she recognized. Smooth concrete walls stretched beneath cold fluorescent lights. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint mixed with expensive cigar smoke. Somewhere in the distance, low voices echoed through the corridor. Claire hesitated. Every instinct suggested backing into the elevator and pretending she had never seen this place, yet curiosity nudged her forward one careful step at a time. At the far end of the hallway stood a heavy steel door resting slightly open, just enough for warm amber light to spill across the polished floor. She heard someone speaking with calm authority, not loudly, but with the effortless confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. She moved closer, intending only to ask whether she had wandered into a restricted mechanical area. Instead, she looked through the narrow opening and realized this was no maintenance room. A long oak table occupied the center of a surprisingly elegant underground chamber. Men in tailored dark suits sat around it, folders spread before them alongside architectural blueprints and city maps. No one raised their voice, no one looked frightened, yet the silence between sentences carried a weight that made Claire's heartbeat quicken. The atmosphere wasn't chaotic, it was controlled, disciplined, powerful. She immediately understood she wasn't supposed to be there, even if she couldn't explain why. One man stood apart from the others near the far end of the table. He wore a charcoal suit without a wrinkle, his posture relaxed while everyone else unconsciously oriented themselves toward him. Dark hair framed a composed face that revealed almost nothing. Damien Ferraro didn't need to announce his authority because every subtle movement around him already did. Claire had never seen him before, but something about the room made his role unmistakable. She quietly reached for the steel door, hoping to close it without anyone noticing and retreat before embarrassment turned into trouble. Her fingertips barely brushed the cold metal when a chair shifted inside. Another voice stopped speaking mid-sentence. The silence became absolute. Claire froze. Every conversation ended at once. She slowly lifted her eyes and found Damien already looking directly at her. She expected anger. She expected security guards. She expected someone to demand an explanation. Instead, he simply studied her for several long seconds with an expression so calm it became unsettling. His gaze lingered just long enough to notice the employee badge clipped to her blazer, the rainwater still glistening along the sleeve of her coat, and the thick audit binder tucked beneath her arm. She wasn't part of this world. He could tell instantly. Claire swallowed, forcing herself to speak. "I'm sorry, I think I took the wrong elevator." Her voice sounded smaller than she intended inside the enormous room. Nobody answered. One of the men shifted impatiently, but Damien raised a single hand without taking his eyes off her. The movement was almost imperceptible, yet the room obeyed immediately. Whatever interruption had almost happened simply vanished. Then something completely unexpected happened. Damien smiled. It wasn't warm enough to comfort her or cold enough to threaten her. It was the restrained smile of someone who had just recognized a possibility nobody else had noticed. Claire couldn't understand why that frightened her more than anger would have. She instinctively stepped backward toward the hallway, already planning to apologize again before leaving forever. Damien walked toward the doorway at an unhurried pace, each measured step echoing softly across the concrete floor until he stopped only a few feet away. Up close, he appeared remarkably composed. his voice low and almost conversational when he finally spoke. "Miss Dawson," he said, reading the name printed on her badge without asking. "You've had a very unusual evening." Claire's pulse stumbled. She hadn't introduced herself. She opened her mouth to explain, but before a single word escaped, Damien reached past her, not aggressively, not hurriedly, and wrapped one hand around the steel handle. His eyes never left hers as the heavy door swung shut with deliberate precision. The lock engaged with one quiet metallic click that echoed through the corridor like the final note of a song she suddenly realized had only just begun. What Claire didn't know was that less than a mile away, someone had been waiting for exactly that sound. The sound of the lock settling into place lingered far longer than the click itself. Claire Dawson stood perfectly still, her fingers tightening around the audit binder until the edges pressed into her palms. Damien Ferraro did not step closer. He simply regarded her with the same unsettling calm, as though he were studying a problem instead of a frightened stranger. Behind him, the men around the long table remained silent, waiting for his next instruction instead of reacting to the unexpected interruption. Claire searched every face for a hint that someone might laugh and explain this. Had all been an unfortunate misunderstanding. No one did. The room felt insulated from the rest of Chicago, disconnected from traffic, rain, and ordinary life above ground. Damien finally broke the silence. "You took the wrong elevator." His voice carried neither accusation nor amusement. It sounded like a simple observation. Claire nodded quickly. "I did. I am sorry. I can leave now and forget everything happened." One of the seated men shifted impatiently, but Damien raised two fingers without looking back. The movement stopped every whisper before it began. Claire noticed that more than the expensive suits or polished conference table, authority did not need volume here. It only required a gesture. Damien glanced toward the binder under her arm. "You came back for work." She hesitated before answering. "An audit file. You are thorough." The unexpected comment caught her off guard. She had prepared herself for suspicion, not conversation. "I am just trying to keep my job." For the first time, something almost human crossed his expression. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. That usually explains more decisions than ambition. Claire could not decide whether that answer comforted her or unsettled her even more. Damien turned toward the others. "The meeting is over." Several men exchanged confused looks. One leaned forward slightly. "Boss?" Damien met the interruption with a single calm glance. Nothing more needed to be said. Chairs slid quietly across the floor as everyone stood. They gathered folders, maps, and documents with remarkable efficiency before disappearing through another exit Claire had not noticed before. Within less than a minute, the enormous room that had seemed so intimidating was nearly empty. She watched them leave, surprised that no one questioned his decision. When the last man disappeared, Damien walked toward the conference table and closed one leather folder before placing it neatly beside another. Every movement appeared deliberate, almost ritualistic. Claire remained beside the steel door, unsure whether she had permission to move. "You are wondering why you are still here," he said without turning around. "Yes, because if someone wanted you gone, they would have argued much harder." She frowned. "I do not understand." Damien rested both hands lightly on the table. "Neither do I." The answer sounded honest enough to make her more uneasy than any lie could have. Unfortunately for Claire, several floors above them, a black sport utility vehicle rolled slowly past the building for the third time that evening. Its driver never entered the parking garage. He simply watched the entrance before making another quiet circle around the block. Inside the underground chamber, Damien picked up Claire's employee identification badge, which had slipped loose during her hurried step backward. He studied it for a brief moment before handing it back. "Claire Dawson, internal audit." She accepted it carefully. "Thank you." "How long have you worked there?" "Almost 4 years, long enough to know every hallway." "Almost, yet tonight you found one you had never seen." Claire nodded again. The contradiction had already begun bothering her. She had reviewed construction records for the building during previous audits. There was no mention of another underground level. "Something is wrong," she admitted quietly. Damien looked toward the ceiling as though listening to sounds only he could hear. "Yes, something is." He walked toward the steel door and unlocked it. Claire instinctively moved, expecting him to let her leave immediately. Instead, another man appeared outside before she reached the hallway. Unlike the others from the meeting, this man looked tense. His breathing was uneven, his suit damp from the rain outside. "Boss," he said carefully, "there is a situation." Damien's expression remained unchanged. "Report. Someone has been asking questions about tonight." Claire felt the air in the corridor grow colder despite the fluorescent lights overhead. Damien spoke without raising his voice. How long? Less than 30 minutes. Claire's heartbeat quickened. The meeting had barely ended. Whoever was asking questions could not possibly know she had wandered downstairs by accident. Damien slowly turned back toward her. For the first time since she had entered the hidden level, his eyes revealed the faintest trace of concern. Not for himself, for the circumstances unfolding around her. "Miss Dawson," he said quietly, "if what I suspect is true, leaving this building tonight may be the most dangerous decision you could make." Claire stared at him, trying to decide whether the warning itself was real or merely another method of keeping her inside. She had no way of knowing that, less than a mile away, someone had already received confirmation that the unexpected witness had survived the meeting, and the next move had already begun. Rain blurred the city into streaks of silver as Claire Dawson followed Damien Ferraro through a narrow service corridor that connected the hidden level to a private parking structure. She still carried the audit binder against her chest, almost forgetting it had been the only reason she returned to the building that night. Every answer she expected seemed to create two new questions instead. Damien stopped beside a dark luxury sport utility vehicle waiting beneath a row of dim industrial lights. The driver immediately stepped outside and opened the rear passenger door without speaking. Claire remained where she was. "I am not getting into that vehicle," she said quietly. Damien faced her without the slightest sign of irritation. "That is your decision." She frowned, surprised by the response. "You just said leaving might be dangerous." "I did. Then why are you giving me a choice?" His eyes rested on hers for a brief moment. "Because fear is a poor substitute for trust." The answer lingered between them while the rain echoed against the concrete ceiling overhead. Claire looked toward the garage exit. Freedom was only a short walk away. Her own sedan sat somewhere on the opposite side of the building. She could call the police. She could drive home. She could convince herself none of this had happened. Yet another thought quietly pushed through the confusion. If someone had already started asking questions less than 30 minutes after she wandered into the hidden meeting, then somehow her mistake had become important to people she had never met. Damien did not rush her. He simply waited. Finally, Claire stepped into the vehicle, before taking his place behind the wheel. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar and leather instead of expensive cologne or perfume. No music played. No one reached for a phone. As they pulled onto the wet Chicago streets, Claire noticed Damien watching the passing traffic instead of her reflection in the window. He looked less like a man escaping danger than someone calculating possibilities several moves ahead. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere quieter. Am I being detained? No. Then why can I not simply go home?" Damien answered after several seconds. "Because I do not know whether your home is still safe." Claire turned toward him. "You keep saying things you cannot prove." "Correct. Why?" "Because I refuse to pretend certainty when I do not have it." That answer frustrated her more than silence would have. She had expected manipulation. Instead, every response sounded measured, almost painfully honest. Unfortunately for Claire, another vehicle merged into traffic 3 blocks behind them without attracting attention. Its headlights remained at a comfortable distance while matching every turn. Inside, 2 men exchanged only a few quiet words before one of them looked down at a photograph displayed on his phone. It showed Claire smiling at a company volunteer event 6 months earlier. Back inside Damien's vehicle, the downtown skyline slowly disappeared behind older neighborhoods lined with brick buildings and quiet tree-covered streets. The driver finally entered a gated property hidden behind tall wrought iron fencing and mature oak trees. The residents waiting beyond surprised Claire again. She expected something extravagant. Instead, the large stone house looked understated, almost invisible among the surrounding homes. It resembled the kind of historic estate that wealthy families quietly maintained for generations rather than showing off to strangers. As soon as the vehicle stopped beneath the covered entrance, Damien stepped out first. A middle-aged woman opened the front door before they reached it. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, and she wore a simple navy sweater instead of a uniform. "Everything is ready," she said calmly. Damien nodded. "Thank you, Margaret." Claire noticed the older woman's eyes soften for just an instant when they met hers. There was concern there, but not fear. Margaret led Claire into a spacious sitting room filled with bookshelves, warm lamps, and the faint scent of fresh coffee. A fireplace crackled quietly despite the summer rain outside. Nothing about the room resembled the secret underground chamber she had just left. Damien remained near the doorway. "You may use any room on the first floor. Margaret will help you with whatever you need." Claire stared at him. "You are treating me like a guest. Tonight that is safer than treating you like a witness." Before she could respond, a faint vibration interrupted the silence. Damien removed a phone from his jacket and glanced at the screen. Claire watched the calm leave his expression for the first time. It was subtle, almost invisible, but unmistakable. He read the message twice before locking the screen again. Margaret noticed it too. "Bad news?" she asked quietly. Looked toward the rain-covered windows. "Someone entered Miss Dawson's apartment less than 10 minutes ago." Claire felt every thought inside her stop at once. She had not told anyone where she lived. She had not even said which part of the city she called home. Damien slowly lifted his eyes to meet hers. "Now do you understand why I could not let you drive there alone?" What Claire did not know was that the people searching her apartment were not looking for documents, money, or evidence. They were looking for confirmation that she had seen something she was never supposed to survive. Morning arrived slowly behind a curtain of steady rain, turning the tall windows of the stone house into blurred mirrors that reflected a world Claire Dawson no longer recognized. She had slept only a few scattered hours on the sofa in the quiet sitting room, waking each time an unfamiliar floorboard creaked or the old house settled against the wind. Margaret had left a folded blanket and a fresh cup of coffee on the side table before sunrise, without asking questions that Claire was not prepared to answer. The kindness felt strangely ordinary, and somehow that made the previous night's events even more difficult to understand. She walked toward the window, watching drops of water race down the glass while trying to organize the facts the way she organized every financial audit. She had entered the office to retrieve a missing binder. She had taken an elevator that should not have reached another underground level. She had witnessed a private meeting led by Damien Ferraro. Within 30 minutes, someone had apparently entered her apartment. The timeline refused to make sense. Claire quietly opened the audit binder, still resting beside the sofa. The familiar spreadsheets and shipping records should have been comforting, but one page immediately caught her attention. A printed delivery schedule listed the previous week's maintenance work inside the logistics building. She scanned each line twice before stopping on one small detail. Elevator inspection had been completed only 3 days earlier. According to the report, access below the standard basement had been permanently disabled years ago. Claire frowned. She remembered approving part of the vendor payment herself. If the restricted level had supposedly been inaccessible, then how had the elevator taken her there so easily? Someone had changed the controls after the inspection, or the report itself had never been accurate. The thought settled heavily in her mind. This had never been a simple accident. Footsteps echoed softly behind her. Damien entered the room carrying another folder, his jacket replaced by a dark sweater that made him appear less like the composed figure from the underground meeting and more like an executive beginning an ordinary workday. "You found something," he said, noticing the open documents before she spoke. Claire looked up. "Your building records do not match what happened." Damien remained silent, allowing her to continue. The restricted level should not have been accessible. She slid the inspection report across the table. "Someone changed something after this was filed." Damien studied the page without touching it, or someone expected the right person to find the wrong elevator. Claire looked at him carefully. "You already suspected that. I suspected many things, but not me." "No." The honesty in that single word carried more weight than a complicated explanation ever could. Claire crossed her arms. "If I was never supposed to be involved, then why did you keep me here instead of sending me somewhere else?" Damien walked toward the fireplace before answering. "Because whoever arranged last night wanted 2 outcomes, which were either you disappeared before speaking to anyone." He paused briefly while watching the flames move behind the glass. "Or you became frightened enough to accuse the wrong people." Claire slowly replayed every moment since leaving the office. She had assumed Damien's organization represented the greatest danger because it was the only danger she had actually seen. But someone else had apparently been moving unseen from the beginning. Unfortunately for Claire, less than 5 miles away, a maintenance supervisor sat alone inside a small office reviewing security footage from the previous evening. He watched the elevator descend below the basement, then disappear from every available camera before returning nearly an hour later. Without hesitation, he removed the recording drive, slipped it into a plain envelope, and quietly left the building through a rear exit. Back inside the house, Margaret entered carrying breakfast before noticing the documents spread across the table. "You look like two accountants preparing for tax season," she joked gently. Claire almost smiled despite herself. It was the first normal sentence anyone had spoken since yesterday afternoon. Margaret placed the plates down before looking toward Damien. Someone called again. His expression remained calm. "The same number?" She nodded. They asked whether the guest was comfortable. Claire felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. "They knew I was here?" Margaret answered softly. "They did not mention your name." Damien looked toward Claire with quiet certainty. "Which means they were guessing." Claire stared back at him. "Or testing whether someone inside this house would confirm it." The room fell silent. Damien's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly before he looked down at the inspection report again. For the first time since they met, Claire noticed something unexpected. It was respect. She had followed the evidence instead of the assumptions. Damien slowly closed the folder. "Miss Dawson," he said, his voice calm but unmistakably more serious than before, "I think you just found the first real clue." What neither of them knew was that the missing security recording had already begun its journey toward the one person who had been carefully arranging every move from the shadows long before Claire ever stepped into the wrong elevator. The smallest inconsistency often carried the greatest truth, and Claire Dawson had built her entire career on noticing details that everyone else ignored. The inspection report remained open on the coffee table, while rain continued to whisper against the tall windows of the old stone house. Damien Ferraro stood beside the fireplace without interrupting her thoughts. He had the patience of someone who understood that conclusions reached too quickly were usually the wrong ones. Claire picked up a pencil Margaret had left beside a notepad and began drawing a simple timeline instead of looking at the financial documents themselves. "The elevator inspection happened on Tuesday," she said quietly. "The report was approved Wednesday afternoon. I returned to the office Thursday night. If the restricted level was disabled on paper but operational in reality, then someone changed access after the inspection was completed." Damien nodded once. "Continue." Claire drew another line beneath the first. "The meeting was already taking place before I arrived. That means whoever changed the elevator expected someone to use it before the meeting ended." She paused, tapping the pencil lightly against the paper. "But they could not have known it would be me specifically." Damien folded his arms. "Unless they wanted anyone." Claire looked up. Exactly. The realization settled over the room with surprising weight. She had spent nearly 24 hours believing she had been singled out. Now the evidence suggested something very different. The trap had not required Claire Dawson. It had required an unexpected witness. She leaned back slowly. Someone wanted an outsider to stumble into that room. Damien remained silent for several seconds before answering, which means the meeting itself was never the primary target. Claire felt another piece of the puzzle quietly slide into place. The witness was. Margaret entered carrying fresh coffee, stopping just long enough to sense the seriousness in the room before placing the tray on the table. "You both have the same expression now," she observed with a faint smile. Claire looked confused. What expression? The one people have when they finally stop asking the wrong question. Margaret left as quietly as she had entered, leaving Claire unexpectedly thoughtful. She realized she was no longer trying to prove Damien had lied to her. Instead, both of them were trying to understand the same mystery from different directions. That shift felt small, but it changed everything. Damien walked toward a bookshelf and removed a leather folder from the top shelf. He carried it back without opening it immediately. "There have been 3 unusual maintenance requests in that building during the last 2 months," he said. "Different contractors, different companies, none connected on paper." Claire accepted the folder and quickly scanned the summaries inside. Every contractor had worked on a different system: electrical wiring, security cameras, elevator controls. Individually, nothing appeared suspicious. Together they formed a pattern. "Someone has been modifying the building in stages," she whispered. Damien gave a slight nod, without attracting attention. Claire turned another page and froze. One contractor's invoice had been approved using an electronic signature that looked familiar. She searched her memory before suddenly recognizing it. This signature belongs to a regional facilities director. "You know him?" Damien asked. "Only professionally," she frowned. "But he retired 6 months ago." Silence settled across the room again. Claire checked the date twice. The authorization had supposedly been signed 3 weeks earlier. That was impossible. Either someone had used his credentials after retirement, or the record itself had been altered. Someone is cleaning the paperwork, she said quietly, just enough to hide the real trail. Damien studied her carefully. You noticed that faster than my own analysts. Claire almost laughed at the irony, because they were probably looking for criminals. She closed the folder gently. Auditors look for paperwork that pretends to be ordinary. Unfortunately for both of them, a courier entered a small warehouse on the south side of Chicago at that exact moment and handed a sealed envelope to a waiting man whose face remained hidden behind tinted office glass. Inside the envelope rested only one item: the missing security recording from the logistics building. The man inserted the drive into a computer without speaking. Grainy footage appeared on the monitor, showing the elevator descending below the basement before stopping at the hidden level. Several minutes later, the image captured Claire stepping into the hallway with the audit binder still under her arm. The unknown observer watched the recording once, then quietly smiled before deleting a copy from the system. Back inside the stone house, Claire stared through the rain at the grey Chicago skyline barely visible beyond the trees. If someone arranged all this, she said softly, then they wanted me to survive long enough to become part of the story. Damien's expression remained unreadable, but his next words carried unusual certainty. No. Claire turned toward him. Then what did they want? He looked at the inspection report still lying open on the table before answering. They wanted me to believe you were part of their plan. Claire felt the meaning strike almost instantly. If Damien had reached that conclusion from the beginning, he would have treated her as an enemy instead of protecting her. Every decision after the meeting had depended on one simple choice. He had decided to trust his own judgment instead of the appearance someone else had carefully constructed. Neither of them noticed the telephone resting quietly on the side table until it rang once. Margaret answered from the hallway. Her calm expression disappeared as she listened before slowly covering the receiver with her hand. She looked directly at Damien. The caller only said one sentence, she whispered. They said the next witness will not be an accident. The most convincing lie was rarely the one spoken out loud. It was the one carefully supported by just enough evidence to make the truth seem impossible. Claire Dawson could not stop thinking about the anonymous phone call. The words echoed through the quiet house long after Margaret had gently placed the receiver back on its cradle. The next witness will not be an accident. Whoever had made the call wanted Damien Ferraro to hear that message. More importantly, they wanted him to react. Claire stood beside the rain-covered window, watching grey clouds drift slowly across the Chicago skyline while replaying every clue in her mind. The altered elevator, the impossible maintenance records, the retired executive's electronic signature, the anonymous calls. None of them pointed toward a single obvious suspect. Instead, they all seemed designed to point in different directions at once. Damien entered carrying a thin folder that contained several printed photographs. He placed them across the dining table without saying a word. Claire immediately recognized the logistics building, different camera angles, different days, delivery trucks arriving, employees entering, contractors carrying equipment cases through service entrances. She studied each image carefully before stopping on one photograph showing a maintenance crew replacing ceiling panels near the elevator bank. This company installed the new control module, Damien explained. They completed the work 4 days before the meeting. Claire examined the uniforms. Everything appeared legitimate until she noticed one worker wearing a company identification badge attached upside down. Most people would never notice such a detail. Auditors always did. He is pretending to belong there, she said quietly. Damien looked at the photograph again. Because of the badge, she nodded. Real technicians stop seeing their badges after the first week. They clip them on automatically. Upside down usually means someone put it on while concentrating on looking the part instead of actually doing the job. Damien remained silent for several moments before making a phone call. He spoke only one sentence. Verify every employee shown in these photographs. Then he ended the call without another word. Claire folded her arms. You already checked them once. We verified the company. He looked toward the photograph still resting beneath her hand, not the habits. For the first time since entering this unfamiliar world, Claire realized her ordinary profession gave her an advantage that experienced investigators might not possess. Criminals often searched for dramatic evidence. Auditors searched for ordinary mistakes. Margaret quietly served lunch in the sunroom overlooking the rain-soaked gardens. Neither Claire nor Damien spoke much while eating. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt focused. Finally, Claire looked across the table. Can I ask you something? Damien nodded. Why did you believe I was innocent? he answered without hesitation, because frightened people usually try to explain themselves. Claire frowned slightly. And spies? They usually try to explain everything else. She considered that answer longer than she expected. Unfortunately for both of them, nearly 12 miles away, a conference room inside the logistics company's regional office had become unexpectedly busy. Senior managers gathered around a polished table after receiving reports that someone had requested archived maintenance files from multiple departments that morning. One executive calmly suggested restricting future access until the review was complete. No one questioned the recommendation. No one noticed that the suggestion came from the only person in the room who had personally approved every contractor involved during the previous 2 months. Back inside the stone house, Damien's phone vibrated again. This time the report arrived almost immediately. He read the message before handing the screen to Claire. "The technician wearing the upside-down badge never worked for that contractor," she read aloud. "His employment records do not exist." Claire looked up. "So," Damien nodded once. "That appears likely. Then we know who did it." Damien slowly shook his head. "No." Claire blinked in surprise. "Why not?" He walked toward the bookshelf where several city maps remained neatly rolled inside a wooden stand. "Because someone wanted us to find him." He unrolled one map across the table and marked 3 locations with a pencil: the elevator, the maintenance company, the anonymous calls. Claire followed the marks carefully. The locations formed a rough triangle around downtown Chicago. Then she noticed something strange. Each point depended on someone outside Damien's organization. Contractors, building management, telephone routing services. None required access to his trusted inner circle. "Everything leads outward," she whispered. Damien looked directly at her. "Exactly." Claire felt a brief wave of satisfaction. They finally had a suspect, but that feeling disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. Every clue they had uncovered seemed almost too convenient, as though someone expected them to connect those exact dots. "It feels staged," she admitted quietly, "like someone left breadcrumbs." Damien gave the faintest nod. "And people who leave breadcrumbs usually want someone to follow them." Claire slowly looked back at the photograph of the false technician. The upside-down badge no longer looked like a careless mistake. It looked intentional, a clue waiting to be discovered. She placed the photograph back onto the table. "Then he is not our real suspect." Damien's expression remained perfectly calm, but there was unmistakable approval in his eyes. "No," he said. "He is the story someone wants us to believe." Before either of them could continue, the security monitor beside the front entrance chimed softly. Margaret glanced toward the screen and froze. A delivery van had stopped outside the front gate carrying a package addressed not to Damien Ferraro, but to Claire Dawson by name. Even though almost no one should have known she was there, sometimes the answer arrives disguised as another question. Claire Dawson stood beside the security monitor, staring at the image of the white delivery van parked outside the wrought iron gate while rain continued falling in steady sheets across the driveway. The package resting on the passenger seat looked ordinary. Wrapped in plain brown paper with her full name neatly printed across the label, there was no company logo, no return address. Nothing about it appeared remarkable except for one impossible detail. Almost no one should have known where she was. Margaret quietly folded her hands together. It arrived less than 3 minutes ago. Damien Ferraro never took his eyes off the monitor. Did the driver request a signature? Margaret shook her head. He only said the delivery was time-sensitive. Claire looked toward Damien. If this is another trap, why would they send something here instead of simply watching the house? Damien answered without hesitation. "Because they want us to make a decision." He pressed a button beside the monitor, activating an exterior speaker near the gate. "Leave the package where it is and drive away." The driver nodded once, placed the parcel on a small stone bench outside the entrance, then calmly returned to the van. Within seconds, the vehicle disappeared around the corner without looking back. Claire frowned. "That was too easy." "Exactly," Damien replied. Nearly 20 minutes passed before one of the house staff, wearing protective gloves, retrieved the package and carried it into a separate room where it was carefully examined. Claire expected complicated equipment or hidden electronics. Instead, the box contained only 3 items: a small brass elevator key, a printed photograph, and a folded note. Damien placed everything on the table while Claire leaned closer. The photograph showed the hidden conference room from the night she had wandered inside. The image had clearly been taken before the meeting even began. Every chair was still empty except one. Damien stood alone beside the long oak table reviewing documents. Claire immediately noticed what mattered most. The photograph had been taken from inside the room. "Someone was already there," she whispered. Damien nodded slowly. "Someone close enough to prepare the meeting." Claire unfolded the handwritten note. Only one sentence appeared across the center of the page. "You protected the wrong witness." She read it twice before looking up. "The wrong witness?" Damien remained unusually quiet. Claire picked up the brass key and turned it over in her hand. A small engraved number matched the maintenance report she had studied earlier. Suddenly every clue from the previous 2 days aligned in a completely different pattern. She walked toward the timeline, still resting on the coffee table, and rearranged several notes she had written that morning. "No," she said softly, almost to herself. "This was never about proving I saw the meeting." Damien watched without interrupting. Claire moved another note. The altered elevator, the fake maintenance worker, the anonymous calls, the package. She slowly looked at Damien. "Every clue has been trying to make you focus on me." Silence settled over the room. Claire continued before anyone else could speak. "If I had never entered that hallway, another person eventually would have. Anyone. A janitor, a courier, a building engineer. It did not matter who the witness was." She placed the brass key beside the inspection report. The witness was never the target. Damien's expression changed almost imperceptibly, not because he doubted her reasoning, but because he had reached the same conclusion at the exact same moment. Claire took a slow breath. The real target was them. Meaning? Claire pointed toward the photograph. Someone inside that organization wanted Damien to believe an outsider had discovered his meeting because of a security failure. She turned another page of the maintenance records. If he believed that, he would begin searching outside his own circle. Damien quietly finished her thought. While the real betrayal remained inside, Claire looked at him. "The trap was never built around me." "No," Damien said. "You simply walked into it. Unfortunately for everyone inside the house, less than 2 miles away, a man sitting alone in a quiet office closed a folder labeled Building Access Project and placed it inside a locked cabinet. He had spent months arranging contractors, maintenance schedules, electronic records, and anonymous messages with one purpose in mind: not to eliminate Damien Ferraro, not to expose his meetings, but to make him lose faith in the people closest to him while protecting the one person responsible for everything. Back inside the house, Claire studied the photograph one final time before noticing something she had completely overlooked. Reflected in the polished conference table was the faint outline of another person standing behind the camera. Only a shoulder and part of a sleeve were visible, but one detail immediately stood out. The fabric matched the same distinctive charcoal jacket worn by one of the men seated at the meeting that night. Claire slowly lowered the photograph. "The photographer was not an outsider," she said quietly. "He belonged in the room." Damien met her eyes with complete certainty. "Now we finally know where to start looking." Truth rarely arrived in a single dramatic moment. More often it revealed itself one careful observation at a time, until every illusion quietly collapsed under its own weight. Claire Dawson placed the photograph beneath a reading lamp, adjusting the angle several times until the polished surface of the conference table reflected more detail. The faint outline behind the camera remained frustratingly incomplete, but the charcoal sleeve was enough to eliminate one impossible theory. Whoever had taken the picture belonged inside Damien Ferraro's trusted circle long before Claire ever stepped into the hidden meeting. Damien remained beside the window overlooking the rain-soaked gardens, saying nothing while Claire continued examining every inch of the image. He had stopped treating her conclusions as fortunate guesses. He now waited for them the way experienced surgeons waited for laboratory results. Claire finally looked up. "May I see photographs from previous meetings?" Damien turned toward her. "Why?" "Because if the same people attended regularly, I want to see whether anyone always stands in the same place." Less than 15 minutes later, several neatly organized folders covered the dining table. They contained photographs from charity events, business dinners, foundation galas, and legitimate corporate gatherings spanning almost 2 years. None showed illegal activity, none appeared suspicious, yet together they documented the routines of people who had known one another for years. Claire ignored their faces at first. Instead, she traced seating arrangements, body language, and small habits. One man consistently preferred the far left side of every room. Another always removed his watch before sitting. A third never carried papers himself. Damien quietly observed while she sorted dozens of images into separate groups. "You are not looking for a person," he finally said. Claire nodded. "I am looking for a pattern." She placed one photograph beside another, then another. Gradually, an unexpected sequence emerged. In every gathering where confidential documents appeared, one specific attendee always occupied a position that offered a clear line of sight toward the entrance and everyone seated at the table. It was subtle enough to escape casual notice. It was also too consistent to be coincidence. Claire tapped the final photograph. "This man never chooses the center." Damien leaned closer. "Marco Ellison." Claire read the name written on the back. "What is his role?" "Operations coordinator." "Meaning?" "He organizes meeting locations, schedules, and logistics." Claire slowly exhaled. He never needed to betray information after meetings because he already knew everything before they began. Damien did not answer immediately. His silence revealed more than surprise. It suggested disappointment. Unfortunately for Claire, less than 3 miles away, Marco Ellison sat inside a quiet cafe reading a newspaper beside the front window. His phone vibrated once. A single encrypted message appeared before disappearing almost instantly. The contents were brief. They found the photograph. Marco calmly folded the newspaper, left cash beneath his coffee cup, and walked into the rainy afternoon with the same unhurried confidence as any ordinary office worker leaving for lunch. Back inside the house, Claire studied another folder containing maintenance authorizations. "He approved room reservations," she murmured. "He coordinated exactly when the meeting would happen. He could arrange every piece without anyone questioning it." Damien crossed his arms. "That explains opportunity." Claire looked directly at him, but not motive. He gave a slight nod. "Exactly." Claire leaned back, refusing to rush toward an easy conclusion. "Someone wanted us to discover him eventually." Damien raised one eyebrow. "You still believe that?" "Yes." She picked up the anonymous note delivered earlier that morning. "If Marco were truly trying to remain invisible, why send us clues that point toward the conference room? Why remind us that you protected the wrong witness?" She placed the note beside the photograph. "Because someone wants you to confront him." Damien remained thoughtful. "Meaning Marco may know something, without being the person controlling everything," Claire finished quietly. The room fell silent again. Margaret entered carrying fresh tea before noticing the document spread across every available surface. She smiled gently. "The house has started looking like an accounting office." Claire laughed softly for the first time in days. The sound surprised even her. Damien glanced toward her, and although his expression remained composed, something subtle had changed between them. The distance created by fear had begun giving way to genuine respect. He no longer viewed Claire as someone caught in his world by accident. She had become the one person willing to question every assumption, including her own. The quiet moment ended when Damien's phone rang. He listened without interrupting before lowering the device slowly. "Our analyst verified Marco's travel records," he said. "He has attended every confidential planning session for the last 18 months. Claire waited. Damien continued. "Except one." "Which one?" He looked toward the original photograph taken before the underground meeting. "The meeting you accidentally witnessed." Claire frowned. Damien nodded once. "Officially, yes." Claire's eyes immediately returned to the reflected sleeve behind the camera. "Then whoever took that photograph wanted us to believe Marco was somewhere else." She slowly stood, feeling another carefully constructed illusion begin to crack. "We have been asking whether Marco is the traitor." She looked at Damien with growing certainty. "The better question is who needed Marco to disappear from the room before anyone started looking for the real person standing behind the camera. Trust was never built through promises. It was built through choices made when neither person had anything to gain." Claire Dawson stood before the wall of photographs for several long moments, allowing every clue to settle into place before reaching for another folder. The rain outside had finally eased into a fine mist that wrapped the old stone house in quiet grey light. For the first time since she had stepped into the hidden underground meeting, she no longer felt like someone trapped inside another person's world. She felt like part of the search for the truth. Damien Ferraro walked to the large oak desk and unfolded a detailed floor plan of the logistics building. "If Marco was intentionally removed from the attendance records," he said, "someone expected us to examine them eventually." Claire leaned over the blueprint. "Then whoever designed this plan understands how you investigate problems." Damien looked at her with calm curiosity. "Explain." She pointed to several marked rooms around the hidden conference chamber. Every false trail depended on predictable behavior. The maintenance reports, the contractor records, the anonymous calls. They all assumed you would look outward first. She paused before tracing another line with her finger. Whoever planned this also assumed you trusted your own organization more than anyone outside it. Damien remained silent. Claire continued, "That assumption failed because you did not treat me like an enemy." The words hung quietly between them. Damien gave the faintest nod. "And because you refused to accept convenient answers." Margaret entered carrying fresh coffee before quietly placing another envelope on the desk. "This arrived through the private courier network," she explained. "No return address." Damien opened it carefully. Inside rested a single sheet containing copies of building access logs from the night of the meeting. Claire immediately recognized the formatting. They were authentic security records. She scanned each timestamp until one entry caught her attention. The service elevator had been activated exactly 6 minutes before she entered the building. "Someone arrived before everyone else," she whispered. Damien stepped closer. "Do you recognize the authorization code?" Claire studied it carefully before slowly shaking her head. "Not the code." She looked again, "but the sequence." Damien waited. "Every company uses different employee numbers," Claire explained. "This one is not an employee identification." She circled the final 4 digits. "It is a temporary contractor credential." Damien frowned slightly. "The same type used during maintenance work, exactly." Claire looked back at the photographs spread across the table. Whoever entered first did not arrive as an executive. They arrived disguised as someone who belonged there because of the renovations, unfortunately for both of them, several miles away. Marco Ellison unlocked a small storage unit hidden behind an ordinary commercial warehouse. Shelves lined the walls, holding boxes filled with archived construction documents, duplicate security badges, and carefully labeled maintenance uniforms collected over many months. He opened one cabinet, removed a plain cardboard file marked Project Lantern, then quietly stared at it without opening it. After several seconds, he closed the cabinet again and walked away, leaving the file exactly where it had been. Back inside the house, Damien's phone vibrated once. He listened to a brief report before ending the call. "The contractor credential belongs to a man named Thomas Granger," he said. "He left the company nearly a year ago." Claire did not react immediately. Instead, she looked back toward the envelope. Damien understood instantly. "Just like the facilities director." Claire nodded. "Someone keeps recycling identities that no longer attract attention." She walked slowly toward the fireplace while organizing the pattern in her mind. They borrow forgotten names because nobody expects old records to become important again. Damien watched her carefully. "You think this person has been planning everything for a long time?" Claire turned toward him. "Long before I ever entered that elevator." The realization changed the emotional weight of every event that had followed. Claire had never been the cause of the conspiracy. She had simply become the first person outside it to notice the cracks. Damien crossed the room and stopped beside the window. "You realize this means you are free to leave whenever you choose." Claire looked surprised. "You would let me?" He met her eyes without hesitation. "Keeping you here against your will would only prove our enemy understood me better than I understand myself." Claire walked toward the front entrance and rested her hand lightly against the polished brass handle. Beyond the glass waited the quiet street, the mist, and a life that suddenly felt very far away. She remained there for several seconds before slowly removing her hand from the door. Damien said nothing. He did not ask her to stay. He did not try to persuade her. Claire turned back toward the room. "If I leave now," she said softly, "someone else will continue rewriting the truth." She walked back to the table and picked up the access logs. "I am staying because I want to know who has been writing this story from the beginning." For the first time since their paths crossed, Damien offered a genuine smile, one without calculation or restraint. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough for Claire to realize that somewhere between fear and suspicion, they had quietly become partners searching for the same answer. What neither of them knew was that, at that exact moment, someone had already learned Claire had chosen to remain inside the house voluntarily. And that single decision forced the hidden architect behind every false clue to begin preparing an entirely different strategy. Every carefully constructed deception eventually reached the moment when it could no longer survive another honest question. The rain finally stopped sometime after sunset, leaving the stone house surrounded by a quiet stillness that felt almost unnatural after 2 days of relentless storms. Claire Dawson sat alone at the dining table, comparing the building access logs with the maintenance records for what felt like the 100th time. Every borrowed identity had one thing in common. Each belonged to someone who had quietly disappeared from the system months before their credentials suddenly became active again. The pattern was too disciplined to be random. It reflected someone who understood not only security procedures but also how ordinary people trusted paperwork more than memory. Damien Ferraro entered carrying a slim leather portfolio. He placed it beside Claire without interrupting her concentration. "Our analyst completed another review," he said. "They found something you asked for." Claire opened the portfolio and discovered attendance records from every confidential planning session during the previous 18 months. She immediately ignored the names and studied the timing instead. Some meetings had changed locations at the last minute. Others had been postponed by only a few hours. At first, the adjustments appeared meaningless, but then another pattern quietly emerged. Every unexpected schedule change had been approved by different people. Yet each approval had reached Damien through exactly the same administrative route. Claire traced the signatures with her finger before looking up. The person behind this never needed authority. Damien waited. They only needed access to information before everyone else received it. Damien leaned over the table. "An invisible gatekeeper," Claire nodded. "Someone who quietly influences decisions without appearing to make them." Margaret arrived carrying fresh tea before placing a folded newspaper beside Damien. "This was delivered through the private mailbox," she explained. The front page reported routine business news, but one article near the bottom mentioned had unexpectedly postponed its annual facilities modernization project. Claire frowned immediately. "That project was approved months ago." Damien looked toward her. "Does that matter?" "Yes." She pointed to the publication date. "It was cancelled this morning." Damien remained silent while Claire continued reading. "Nobody cancels a multi-million-dollar renovation overnight unless someone wants people to stop looking at the building." She slowly closed the newspaper. "The maintenance work is finished. Whoever organized it no longer needs another excuse to keep contractors moving through the property." Unfortunately for them, across the city, Marco Ellison unlocked the same storage unit he had visited earlier that afternoon. This time he removed the cardboard file marked Project Lantern and placed it inside a canvas messenger bag. He stood motionless for several seconds before locking the unit again. He did not look nervous. He looked resigned, as though he had reached the point where following someone else's plan was no longer possible. Back inside the house, Damien's phone vibrated. He answered, listened quietly, then placed the device on the table. "Marco requested a private meeting," he said. Claire looked up immediately. "With you?" Damien nodded. "Tomorrow morning." Silence settled across the room. Claire slowly folded her hands together. "That is too convenient." Damien offered the faintest smile. "You have started saying that often, because every convenient answer has turned out to be another distraction." She stood and walked toward the wall where the photograph still hung in careful order. Her eyes rested on the original image taken before the underground meeting. If Marco wanted to disappear, he already had the chance. She looked back at Damien. If he wanted to betray you, he could have remained invisible. Damien understood where her reasoning was leading before she finished. "So why request a meeting now?" Claire nodded. "Because someone expects you to attend." Damien crossed the room until he stood beside her. "Would you?" Claire thought carefully before answering. "Yes." Damien raised an eyebrow. Claire continued. "Not because I believe he is the mastermind." She looked once more at the reflected sleeve captured in the polished conference table. "But because someone believes he is important enough to become the center of the next move." Damien remained thoughtful. "Then we attend." Claire turned toward him. "With one condition." "Name it." "We stop trying to prove Marco is guilty." Damien studied her expression, and instead Claire answered quietly, "We let him show us who is truly afraid of what he knows." Damien did not respond immediately. Instead, he walked toward the fireplace where the original brass elevator key still rested beside the inspection report. He picked it up and placed it into Claire's hand. "Then tomorrow," he said calmly, "we stop following the clues our enemy left behind and begin following the choices people make instead." Claire closed her fingers around the cold metal key, realizing it no longer represented the wrong elevator or the hidden meeting. It had become a reminder that every locked door opened in two directions depending on who decided to turn the key. What neither of them realized was that, at that exact moment, a second anonymous message reached Marco Ellison's phone containing only 6 words. Make sure she hears the whole truth. Morning arrived beneath a pale grey sky that made the streets of Chicago appear quieter than usual, as though the city itself had paused to witness whatever came next. Claire Dawson sat in the passenger seat, while Damien Ferraro guided the vehicle through nearly empty avenues toward a historic riverside office building where Marco Ellison had requested their meeting. Neither of them spoke much during the drive. There was nothing left to speculate about. The clues had carried them as far as logic alone could go. From this point forward, only people could answer the questions that paperwork never would. The building stood beside the river, restored from an old warehouse into modern executive offices with tall brick walls and enormous windows overlooking the water. Marco had chosen a conference room on the top floor, one that offered privacy without attracting attention. When Claire entered beside Damien, she immediately noticed that Marco had arrived alone, no assistants, no security. Only a leather briefcase resting neatly beside his chair and 2 untouched cups of coffee waiting on the polished table. Marco stood as they entered. His expression was tired rather than frightened. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. Damien remained standing. "You asked for this meeting." Marco nodded once. "Because there are only 2 ways this story ends. Either you continue chasing the wrong person," he looked toward Claire before finishing, "or someone finally explains how all of this actually happened." Claire remained silent, watching his posture more than his words. He looked like a man carrying something heavy for far too long. Marco slowly opened the briefcase and removed a thick folder filled with maintenance contracts, internal memoranda, contractor agreements, and handwritten notes. He carefully pushed the documents toward Claire instead of Damien. "You will understand these better than either of us." Claire opened the first section and immediately recognized familiar approval chains, the same retired executive names, the same contractor identities, the same altered access records. But this time another layer appeared beneath every document: hidden annotations, original approval dates, internal routing slips. Someone had quietly manipulated nearly every administrative process connected to the building for months before the underground meeting ever took place. Claire turned several pages before stopping. "These corrections," she whispered. "They were made after every document had already been approved." Marco nodded. "Always by the same office." Damien finally spoke. "Which office?" Marco met his eyes without hesitation. "Strategic Administration." Claire frowned. "That is not a person." "No," Marco replied calmly. "It is a department with unrestricted access to every operational schedule inside the organization." Claire continued reading until another name appeared repeatedly at the bottom of dozens of internal routing slips. Eleanor Shaw. She looked up. "Who is she?" Marco answered quietly. "Director of Strategic Administration." Damien remained perfectly still. Claire noticed something unusual. He did not appear shocked by the name itself. He appeared disappointed by what it represented. Marco continued. "She never attended meetings. She never approved final decisions. She never appeared in photographs. She simply decided which information reached which people and when." Claire slowly understood the elegance of the deception. "She never betrayed anyone directly." Marco nodded. "She only arranged circumstances." Unfortunately for everyone in the room, less than half a mile away, Eleanor Shaw sat inside her corner office overlooking the Chicago River, calmly placing the last several paper files into a locked archive box. Her desk had already been cleared. Every digital account had been scheduled for permanent transfer by the end of the day. She glanced once at the framed photograph of her staff before quietly removing it from the wall. Back inside the conference room, Claire organized the final documents into chronological order. The entire conspiracy suddenly became painfully clear. Eleanor had not built a trap around Claire Dawson. She had built a system capable of creating an accidental witness whenever she needed one. Contractors adjusted access. Temporary credentials appeared and disappeared. Maintenance projects redirected attention. Anonymous messages manipulated assumptions. Every false clue encouraged Damien to investigate everywhere except the administrative office, quietly coordinating every schedule behind the scenes. Claire slowly closed the final folder. The meeting was never compromised because someone inside the room betrayed it. Marco nodded. It was compromised because someone controlled every detail before anyone entered the room. Damien finally sat down across from him. "Why tell us now?" Marco looked toward the river beyond the windows. "Because I spent months believing I was helping protect the organization from outside threats." He lowered his eyes. "Then I realized I had only been delivering information exactly where someone wanted it to go." Claire studied him carefully. His regret felt genuine. Not theatrical, not convenient, genuine. She looked back toward Damien. He is telling the truth. Damien held Marco's gaze for several long seconds before giving a quiet nod. I believe he is. Relief passed briefly across Marco's face before disappearing almost immediately. He reached into his jacket and removed a single brass access card, placing it carefully on the table between them. If you want proof, he said softly. Everything that remains is inside Eleanor Shaw's archive office. Claire looked down at the card resting beside the folder. The final pieces of the mystery had finally aligned. They no longer needed another theory. They only needed to open one last locked door. The final pieces of the truth were waiting behind a door that had never attracted attention because it was designed to look ordinary. Claire Dawson held the brass access card while Damien Ferraro drove them toward the downtown office where Eleanor Shaw had quietly managed schedules, approvals, and information for years without ever becoming the center of anyone's attention. The building itself reflected her methods: clean glass, neutral colors, efficient design, nothing dramatic, nothing memorable. Margaret had remained behind at the stone house, quietly reminding them before they left that people who built invisible systems rarely expected anyone to notice the smallest details. Claire carried those words with her as they entered the nearly empty administrative floor. Most employees had already left for the day, leaving only the gentle hum of overhead lights and the distant sound of elevators moving through the building. Damien stopped outside an office marked Strategic Administration. The nameplate carried no executive title beyond Eleanor Shaw's name. Claire inserted the brass access card into the reader. A soft green light appeared almost immediately, followed by the quiet click of an unlocked door. Inside, everything looked perfectly organized. Shelves lined the walls with carefully labeled archive boxes arranged in alphabetical order. The desk had already been cleared except for a framed calendar open to the current month and a single fountain pen resting beside it. Claire slowly stepped inside while Damien remained near the entrance, allowing her to observe the room first. She walked toward the calendar and immediately noticed something unusual. Several dates contained tiny pencil marks that had been partially erased. They looked insignificant until she compared them with the meeting schedules Marco had provided earlier. Every confidential gathering matched one of the lightly erased marks. Claire turned toward the archive shelves. She never stored secrets, she said quietly. Damien watched as Claire carefully opened the first archive box. Inside were ordinary administrative reports. The second contained contractor insurance certificates. The third held office supply invoices. None appeared remarkable until Claire noticed that each folder carried 2 filing dates instead of 1. The official submission date had been printed by the system. A second handwritten date reflected when Eleanor had personally reviewed the document. Claire spread several folders across the desk before organizing them chronologically. A pattern immediately emerged. Every important decision had passed through Eleanor's hands days before anyone else knew it existed. She had never needed to change outcomes directly because she always knew what would happen first. Damien quietly approached the desk. "Can you prove it?" Claire nodded. Yes. She pointed toward 3 separate files from different departments. These projects were unrelated, different budgets, different contractors, different executives. She placed the folders side by side, but every one of them reached Eleanor exactly 48 hours before final approval. Damien understood instantly. Enough time to prepare every adjustment. Claire continued searching until she discovered one final archive box stored beneath the desk instead of on the shelves. Unlike the others, it carried no label. Inside rested only one leather notebook. She opened it carefully. The pages contained handwritten observations rather than financial records. Names, meeting dates, administrative notes, short comments describing how people reacted under pressure. Eleanor had spent years documenting personalities instead of transactions. Claire stopped on one page where Damien's name appeared several times beside a single sentence repeated throughout different months. He trusts patterns more than people. She slowly looked up. She believed she understood you. Damien accepted the notebook without speaking. He turned several pages before quietly closing it again. "She understood my habits," he said calmly, "not my decisions. Unfortunately for Eleanor Shaw, less than 10 minutes earlier, she had entered the lobby of a suburban retirement community carrying the final archive box she had removed from her office. She intended to disappear into an ordinary life built on ordinary routines. What she did not know was that the documents left behind had already explained everything she had spent years trying to hide. Back inside the office, Claire continued reading until she reached the final handwritten entry dated the morning after the underground meeting. It contained only one sentence: unexpected variable. Witness survived. Damien remained silent while Claire closed the notebook with extraordinary care. "That is all she wrote?" he asked. Claire nodded. "Because everything after that stopped following her plan." She looked directly at him. "You changed it." Damien slowly shook his head. "No." His voice remained calm but carried an honesty Claire had come to recognize. "We changed it." Claire felt the full meaning of those words settle quietly between them. The conspiracy had not collapsed because of power, threats, or force. It had collapsed because one ordinary auditor refused to ignore inconsistent paperwork, and one man accustomed to controlling every situation had chosen to trust someone he had every reason to doubt. Damien placed the leather notebook back inside the archive box before looking around Eleanor's now empty office one final time. "There is nothing else here?" Claire nodded. "There does not need to be." Every mystery that had begun with the hidden elevator, the anonymous messages, the false maintenance records, and the carefully staged clues had finally been explained without leaving another unanswered question behind. As they turned toward the office door, Claire glanced once more at the spotless desk where Eleanor had quietly directed events for years without ever stepping into the spotlight herself. The room looked exactly as it had when they arrived, but it no longer carried any secrets. The only thing left waiting for them now was the decision each of them would make after the truth no longer needed protection. Every story eventually returns to the place where it truly began, not so the past can be repeated, but so it can finally be understood. 3 weeks later, the city moved forward as though nothing extraordinary had ever happened. The logistics company quietly completed its internal review. Administrative records were corrected. Old authorization systems were permanently replaced. The hidden conference level beneath the downtown building no longer existed as an active meeting place. The steel door remained exactly where it had always been, but now it protected an empty room instead of hidden secrets. Claire Dawson returned to work on a cool Monday morning carrying the same leather portfolio she had carried on the night everything changed. Her co-workers welcomed her back with ordinary conversations about deadlines, weekend plans, and unfinished reports. Nobody knew how close a simple accounting assignment had come to rewriting the course of her life. Claire smiled politely, sat at her desk, and opened the newest audit file waiting in her inbox. The familiar columns of numbers no longer looked ordinary. Every line represented a promise that facts still mattered when people chose to look carefully enough. Across the city, Damien Ferraro stood inside the conference room of his own headquarters, reviewing a completely different kind of report. There were no discussions about hidden meetings or secret maintenance projects anymore. Instead, new operating procedures emphasized independent verification, shared oversight, and transparent approval chains. Several longtime associates looked surprised by the changes, but none questioned them. Damien had spent years believing that control alone protected loyalty. Claire had quietly proven that trust built on honest scrutiny protected far more than silence ever could. Later that afternoon, Claire received a brief handwritten note delivered through ordinary mail instead of a private courier. There was no signature, only an address she immediately recognized. It belonged to the stone house where Margaret still lived. Claire folded the note, finished her workday, and drove there just before sunset. The old oak trees surrounding the property glowed beneath warm autumn light instead of heavy rain. The house appeared peaceful, almost unchanged, except that it no longer felt like a place where someone had been hiding from danger. It felt like a home that had simply been waiting for difficult days to end. Margaret welcomed Claire with the same gentle smile she had offered on that first uncertain morning. "I hoped you would come," she said softly. Claire laughed. "You knew I would." Margaret poured fresh coffee before quietly leaving the sitting room, giving them the privacy neither of them needed to request. Damien stood beside the fireplace exactly where Claire remembered seeing him only days after everything had begun. This time there were no folders spread across the table, no photographs, no maintenance reports, no unanswered questions. Only silence that no longer carried suspicion. Claire looked around the familiar room before smiling. "It seems much smaller now." Damien glanced toward the bookshelves, perhaps because there are fewer secrets inside it. They shared a quiet moment before Claire reached into her coat pocket and removed the small brass elevator key he had placed in her hand before they uncovered the truth. She rested it gently on the table between them. "I think this belongs to you." Damien looked at the key for several seconds before slowly shaking his head. "Why not?" He met her eyes with calm certainty, because it stopped opening doors the day you chose to stay instead of leaving. Claire smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. The key had never represented a building, it represented a decision. She looked toward the window where the last sunlight filtered through the old trees. "There is one thing I never asked." Damien waited patiently. "When you locked that steel door," she paused, remembering the sound that had echoed through the underground hallway on the night they met. "What were you really thinking?" Damien smiled, not the careful smile that had unsettled her the first time, but one free of calculation. "I thought I had just met another problem I needed to control." Claire folded her hands around her coffee cup. "And now," he answered with quiet honesty, "now I know I met the person who reminded me that not every unexpected visitor arrives to destroy what matters. Sometimes they arrive to show you what has already been quietly falling apart." Claire looked toward the front entrance. The same heavy wooden door that had once separated safety from uncertainty now stood slightly open, letting cool autumn air drift gently through the house. Damien noticed her glance and walked toward it without saying another word. He turned the handle completely and stepped aside. "You are free to go whenever you wish." Claire stood slowly. She walked to the doorway and paused beneath the fading evening light. Beyond the gate waited the same city where she had once believed her ordinary life existed untouched by hidden truths. She could leave. She owed no one another explanation. No promise held her there. She looked back once. Damien remained exactly where he stood, making no attempt to stop her. Claire smiled softly, turned away from the open gate and walked back inside the house of her own choosing. Behind her the door remained open. Nothing was locked anymore. Outside, the last light of day settled quietly across the empty driveway, while inside two people who had met because of one impossible mistake finally understood that the strongest doors were never the ones that kept people in. They were the ones left open when trust no longer needed a key.